Hello, this is Don Hall. This segment, we're going to be talking about the first year. So hopefully, if you've decided to go ahead with beekeeping, you've made the decision to move forward, you've got the equipment that you need, you've done your installation. Okay, so after your bees are installed in your box, you're 1 frame deep, you're 3.5 to 4 frames of bees, you're going to feed these bees 1-to-1 syrup to help them draw comb and to fill up excess space. The more space they need, the more comb they will make. A colony of bees is not going to make comb that they don't actively need. So that's why we want to stimulate this growth. With the syrup and with that carbohydrate, they can build a comb and expand. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the nutrition. Out in the wild, the nectar is a carbohydrate that the bees eat. The other thing that they need to survive is the protein. The pollen is the protein. Okay, to raise brood, they need protein. Typically, by the time that we distribute these nukes, end of April, 1st of May, is you've got good pollen coming in. So there's really no need to use a pollen sub or a pollen patty at this point. You just can get away with a carbohydrate, which is the 1-to-1 sugar syrup. Now we feed the 1-to-1 sugar syrup in the spring because of the volume. Okay, so it's really wetter than what they eat because it's a 50-50 mix, 1 part water to 1 part sugar. So these bees are more likely to store it so that they can dry it out. So the more that they store, the more comb that they need, the more storage space, so the more comb that they produce. Typically, it takes a certain age bee to produce the wax. So it might take a little bit for everything to kind of get in sync inside the box. But okay, so the bees are in here, we're feeding them the carbohydrate, the sugar syrup. They're taking it, they'll start off taking it, they'll probably eat a quart a day. As these population expands, the bee that's inside this box, she mated with 10 to 15 drones on her mating flight. Now she's back in here, she can lay 2,000, 2,500 eggs in a day, but more often than not, she's going to lay, 500 to 1,500 eggs in a day because the amount of population that's inside this box determines what the cluster size is. The cluster actually generates heat it's more or less just kind of shivering, but you can't really see it. It's more of a friction thing with their muscles that generates heat. One bee can go up to like 107 degrees Fahrenheit. They keep the inside of this cluster at around 91, 92 degrees when they're actively raising brood, and the queen is in the middle of that heat because that is the perfect temperature. Okay, so that carbohydrate is you want to feed and get them expanding, especially new beekeepers. I recommend that you get inside that box at least every couple of weeks. Now, when you get in there, you want to be, as least invasive as you can. Is you want to go in, you want to look, you want to learn, you want to listen, you want to smell, you want to hear what's going on inside of there, because your first year you're going to learn an incredible amount about what this colony looks like. And now hopefully this colony is going to stay healthy for you so that you learn what the health is. But if something happens wrong, then you've gained a valuable lesson on what a colony looks like that's got a disease or that's having a mite problem. Okay, so we'll skip through this pretty quick. So these bees have been in this box, let's say 2 weeks. We've been feeding them sugar syrup. Okay, so when we inspect, we always want to approach these colonies from the back side. Now, you never want to stand in front of this box because the term beeline comes from these bees coming out of this colony. They make a straight line to whatever field. If there's an alfalfa field down that way about a mile, they'll shoot right out of this box almost. But when the population gets high, it's almost like a machine gun firing out of the front of this box in a straight line. If you get in front of that line, they're going to get agitated at you and you're going to get stung. So you want to step back, and you also want to always wear your protective gear, your hat, your veil, your jacket, your gloves, long sleeve shirt, long pants, some kind of boots or shoes to protect your feet, and they will climb right up your pants legs too, so you want to be careful about that. If something happens and you shake a frame off on the ground, they're going to want to climb up. So if you just try as hard as you can when you're handling these frames, smooth and methodical. You don't want to knock those bees off the frame. Okay, so you want to light your smoker. You know, if use whatever fuel that you've decided on. I like to use burlap because, as I discussed, the temperature of the smoke. Okay, so what I like to do is I like to crack the cover and just put a little bit in there. Now that inner cover that's underneath this telescopic cover has got a vent hole in the top of it. Some people call it a feed hole, depending on what you use it for, but today we're calling it a vent hole. Put a little smoke in there just to let them know what's fixing to happen. Okay, I'm going to move some of these things over. So when we take this cover off, we're going to set it on the ground because we're going to set things back on top of it. Okay, so you want to set it down. Now this inner cover, if this is a new box and a new colony, it's not going to be glued down too much yet, but let's pretend like it's glued down. You know, at this point is we're going to just crack this a little bit and see how those bees are acting. If those bees are kind of, if they rush up, we'll give them a little bit of smoke through the hole, a little bit of smoke on the side, give them a second to kind of calm down. If you crack this inner cover and the bees are just going about their daily routine, then there's no need to worry about it. Now when you pull this inner cover off, set it diagonal on your telescopic cover to limit the points of contact so that you don't squash any bees. Okay, so this right here is, I took the feeder out of it. So let's say that we were using an entrance feeder. Okay, so we get the feeder out of the way. It's got the 10 frames inside the box right here. Okay, so you always want to start at the edge. You want to loosen this up. Now when you're prying these frames apart, when they're new it's not going to matter much, but in the next couple of years they're going to really stick together. So these ears that are on the frame that you can see, it's actually the top of this sidebar sticking up over the top bar. You can see that ear right there. So those ears, if it's spaced perfectly, they're 1/8 of an inch apart. So you want to go between those ears. If you go here and pry it apart, it will break this ear. Okay, so you always want to start at the side. You want to pry it to where it's loose. Get that thing up. You want to take it out. Now typically the outside frame is not going to have a whole lot of activity on it. These bees are going to be on frames 2 through 9. Frames 1 and 10, once the box gets real full after 2 or 3 years, it'll have a lot of bees and comb on it, but at the beginning they're not going to want to touch this outside because it's too hard to control the temperature out there with a small population. Make sure the queen is not on this frame, okay? And then set it aside. Okay, now you can just set it somewhere where it's not going to fall over, not where it's safe. So what you've done is you've created space inside this box. Now you want to remove that frame, just pull it to the side. Now you've got that extra space in there. Now you want to take it up, nice and gentle, as you want to look at it with the sun behind your back, looking down into the cells. These cells, you're going to notice they're pitched uphill. Honeybees build that cell at about a 3%, about a uphill grade. So when they put that nectar in it, when it's got that high moisture content, it kind of holds it in place until they can start drying it out and it starts to get sticky. And then that viscosity just kind of keeps sticking that nectar back to itself when it's thick. So you want to inspect it. You want to gently turn it over and inspect this side. Okay, now we want to put it back into the box. And we want to slide it all the way to the end. Say like this. Okay. So then you want to take frame number 3. Move it out. Inspect. And then put it back, pulling it to the side. And you want to go through the whole box, moving it over, using the space you've created, moving it, checking it, inspecting it, moving it over one frame at a time until you get through it. Now you want to, whenever you get to a stopping point, whenever you run out of bees, as you're going through these frames, is you want to take them and you want to put them back one at a time, back into place where they originally were. You don't want to do it all at one time because you'll roll a queen inside of there. She's the largest one in there, so she's the easiest one to roll. When you get your 9 frames moved over, then you want to put your 10th frame back in the box. Okay, so let's say, just for the sake of saying, when is it time to add a second box? So there's 10 frames inside this box. We work off of 70% rule. When 7 of these frames have active bees on comb, and I'm not talking about a little bit of comb, but I'm talking about bees with brood, with honey on 7 frames, then it's time to add a box. Okay, so 7 frames inside of here have got wax, comb, honey, brood, bees. So then we add a second box onto it. The industry standard is 2 brood boxes to house a honeybee colony. Okay, now this is the brood. Now, typically in the first year, you're not going to be able to harvest honey, but I would say probably about 15 or 20% of new beekeepers end up and they do get a little bit of honey the first year. That's good because a lot of people, everybody's situation is different. You could live on a 500-acre irrigated alfalfa field, or you could live in the middle of a desert over here. So everybody's situation is a little bit different. But so this second brood box, once again, 70% rule. Once you get 7 of these 10 frames full of wax and comb and bees, then you can add a honey super. Okay, so if you want to put a queen excluder, this is the place where it goes because you're trying to keep the brood in the brood boxes. I don't use these, but about half the beekeepers do. Queen excluder because it excludes the queen. So we'll put that on top of that brood box. Then the honey super goes on. Then your inner cover goes back on. This side up, says right there. Then your telescopic cover goes on. Okay, so as you go through the summer, and if you're lucky, you get this on, but hopefully by midsummer you're thinking about adding this box onto here. Okay, so when you do an inspection, you want to go into that box and you're looking for the queen. You're looking for signs of the queen being eggs. Just look, listen, smell, get that whole thing down, learn what they smell like, learn what they sound like, learn how they act. Because if you decide to keep several colonies, you can open that top lid, and if they're acting normal and looking and smelling normal, then they're pretty much normal. If you open and there's a problem, then you can go in and see. Maybe they swarmed. Maybe they've gotten honey bound. So when you're inspecting this, you're looking for signs of the queen, and you're looking to make sure they're not honey bound. Because when these bees come out of these nuke boxes with 5 frames, they can have 2 frames of brood and 2 frames of honey. And the queen will not pass that frame of honey to lay eggs. She'll get swarmy inside that 4 frames, even though she's in a 10-frame box. So when you get honey bound, you want to open that brood nest up, give her a little room to work with, because you don't want to lose your queen to a swarm that early because they won't recover from it. Okay, so you want to feed until you get 2 brood boxes full. Okay? Before you ever put a honey super on, you want to stop feeding syrup because you don't want syrup in your honey super. That's just for honey. Okay, so hopefully let's say you've made it to summer. Okay, when it gets to be summer, I like to test for mites as the population's big. Okay, an alcohol wash is the only way that I'm personally confident in at really testing for a mite load percentage. And an alcohol wash is you take 300 milliliters of bees. It's basically a half a cup. So you go inside of your colony. You don't get right on a frame of wet brood, but you get on the next frame because you don't want to shake a frame of wet brood ever because it will dislodge the larva and the royal jelly and you'll screw up that brood. So you want to go to the next frame because that's where the mites are holding up. They're on these brood frames waiting to jump on those larvae the day before they get capped and start turning into a pupa. And that's where they mature in there and lay eggs on that pupa. So anyway, you want to, not the wet brood frame, but the next frame over, you shake them into a container and you scoop up a half a tub, put them in a mason jar with some rubbing alcohol, shake it up good, swirl it around, and you can tilt it up. There's a lot of different ways you can Google and see different ways to do an alcohol wash, but you can count the mites in the bottom corner of the jar. Okay, now anything less than 5% mite load is acceptable. Anything more you need to treat. So this half a cup of bees, this 300 milliliters of bees, is approximately 300 bees. So if you see 15 mites out of 300 bees, you need to divide it by 3, so you've got 5 mites out of 100 bees, so that's a 5% mite count. Anything less than a 5% mite count, you're okay, kind of. I mean, you want a 1 or a 2, but a 4 or a 5 is very marginal. But at least that will give you an idea of your mite load inside of here. So say that your mite load is too high. Okay, so I use oxalic acid vaporizer and dribble quite a bit. And oxalic acid is very gentle. It's an acid that's actually found inside the box. You know, oxalic acid is the acid that comes from leafy green vegetables. But this time of the year, when you've got so much capped brood, you have to use something that's a little bit stronger. As a beekeeper, we always want to use the most gentle thing we can, but still get the job done. In the summertime, you've got to use something a little bit more harsh, like a formic acid. Okay, so I use a Formic Pro or a Mite Away Quick Strip. These Mite Away Quick Strips are a gel, and they come in these packages here that you open it up, it's resealable. Now, you really and truly are better to use a respirator when you're using this kind of stuff, even the oxalic acid vaporization, because you don't want to breathe that stuff up. And they're gel pads that lay on the top of these frames, and you want to follow the instructions to a T because these are very temperature sensitive. If it's too hot in the summertime, you may not be able to use this because you'll have a very high brood mortality and queen mortality rate using any kind of a formic acid if you're having good hot days. It's typically, I think it's 85 degrees or less for formic stuff. But you want to check for those mites. Now, we treated them in the spring before they came out. So in the summer, you just want to do an alcohol wash right quick to see what you've got. Then you want to go on. So as you come through, let's say we get to Labor Day. Okay, Labor Day is about the time of the year when we start pulling honey supers. Okay, so we're going to take this honey super off. Let's say Labor Day weekend. Queen excluder off. Inner cover back on. Telescopic cover on. Now we're gonna check this box, and by checking it, I mean we're gonna just reach and we're gonna tilt it up. If that doesn't weigh 110 or 120 pounds, and you don't have to weigh it, it's either light or it's heavy. Okay, if it's heavy, then you're probably okay. Now what you want to do is you're going to look inside of there because those bees have stored nectar and syrup too up above themselves, and they've dried it out and they've capped it. So if the bees are primarily down in this bottom box, in this top box, you look inside of there and it's primarily capped honey, then you're good to go for a long time. So you're just checking it to see if it's heavy. You're checking it for stores to make it through the winter. If the bees are up on top and they've had a really dry summer, now is when you want to feed them a lot of syrup, and you're going to want to feed them a 2-to-1 syrup. So it's 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, so that they will. So you'll try to build these boxes up. You're gaining weight to try to get them heavy enough to make it through winter. It's easier to feed syrup in October and November than it is to try to feed a dry carbohydrate substitute later in the winter. Reason being is a bee is a cold-blooded insect, so less than 55 degrees they can't drink a syrup. They'll have to eat a solid. And so it's easier to supplemental feed in the fall than it is to supplemental feed in the winter, but you got to have those heavy boxes. So once you start to feed after Labor Day, make sure you got the weight in those boxes. If you don't, feed, okay? At that point, you want to start thinking about protection. So wind protection, a lot of people use straw bales, a lot of people wrap with felt paper. If you're in a kind of a protected area, it's not that big of a deal. You know, you don't want your lids blowing off. A ratchet strap is good, or a brick on top. As these things have went through the summer, is we want to have removed this entrance reducer. Okay, so after you install them and the population built up, is you want to rotate it to the larger entrance, and then as the bees start to have a traffic jam, you want to remove the entrance. Okay, so in the fall, it's in reverse. You want to start putting it back in. You know, you want the larger hole and then the smaller hole. And what you're doing is you're making that entrance defensible, but you also want to put something on there as a mouse guard. I typically use 1/4-inch hardware cloth, or you can buy a mouse guard that actually fits between these legs on this landing board. But in the winter time, if you live at a higher elevation where your bees go long periods of time in a cluster, mice will go in here and they will make a nest and they will live, and they can destroy a colony while those bees are clustered up, not wanting to get out of there. So you want to always think about these bees in two seasons. Is you have a season of growth and a season of decline. Okay, so the winter solstice, when the winter solstice happens in late January, these bees, they pick up on that increased daylight and they start to raise brood. So when you go through the fall and you come back into the winter time, when you pass that winter solstice, it's time to start thinking about supplemental feed again. Okay, you want to check these boxes. The temperature's still too cold for a syrup because 55 degrees is, below 55 they can't take a syrup. So you've got to feed a fondant or even a dry sugar up on top of the frames so the cluster can come right up underneath it and feed. Okay, typically, depending on your elevation, about a month before dandelions start to bloom is when I like to feed a pollen substitute, a dry pollen substitute, just to kind of help them bump up brood rearing. You don't want to start them too early because once they start raising brood, the queen will lay an egg, it hatches into a larva, then they deposit royal jelly onto it. They have what we call a wet brood pheromone. At this time, those bees are locked onto that wet brood pheromone, and they will sit there and they will starve to death because they won't rotate off of that brood to feed. And so you got to make sure there's feed right on top of the cluster. Honey can be one frame away, and those bees will starve to death because they're locked up on that brood and they won't rotate off to feed unless you get a good warm day. So that's a very susceptible time of the year, is February and March after the winter solstice. Even though it's terrible cold outside sometimes, those bees are already ramping up, getting ready for spring and for that spring flow. Once you get back to temperatures where you're having, nighttime temperatures above freezing, is you want to start to think about feeding 1-to-1 syrup again, because that 1-to-1 syrup, the mass of it is larger, so that you got more storage that will make them draw more comb, fill up more cells. In the second year, that way you get these boxes filled up nice and quick, so you can put the honey super on quicker. That's why in the first year, don't expect to get honey off these things. The second year, if everything goes good, the second year is when you'll pull honey off them. So in the spring, when you pass the winter solstice and, say you're February or March, that's a good time also. I usually treat prophylactically with oxalic acid vaporization that time of the year because it treats the mites, because there's very little brood that's under the caps. The OA vapor is very gentle, but it only kills what we call a phoretic mite that attaches itself to a bee. And so those mites get under those caps. Oxalic acid will not kill those mites under the caps, but early in the year is a very good time to use OA. It's gentle and it kills those mites that are not under those caps. Anyway, I know this was just an introduction, and I hope we've answered a few questions and helped a few people decide whether beekeeping is right for you. I think it's a fantastic hobby. It brings together a very diverse group of people, over a hobby about insects. I think it's pretty incredible myself. But thank you very much for watching, and look forward to talking to you again.